Hey everyone, welcome back. Or, you know, welcome if you've just stumbled here because your brain refuses to shut off again. You're in good company. So, tonight, let's go somewhere quieter. Let's leave behind the glowing screens, the city noises, and the existential dread of unread emails, and step back about 700 years to a small medieval village where the loudest sound you'd hear at night was probably the church bell, or a cow that didn't understand personal space. Tonight, we're talking about a woman you'll never find in the history books. No royal title, no portrait hanging in a dusty gallery, just a name in parish records, and a final entry written, according to later accounts, in red ink. A midwife, someone who spent her entire life bringing life into the world, and maybe, just once, deciding who shouldn't be remembered. So, fluff the pillow. Close your eyes if you like. We're going to drift back into a world of candlelight, superstition, and the quiet kind of mystery that doesn't want to be solved. Let's start somewhere around the late 14th century. England, most likely. Though really this story could fit in France, or Flanders, or a cold corner of the Holy Roman Empire where everyone smelled faintly of onions and despair. The Black Death had already swept through a generation earlier. So villages were still rebuilding, half empty, half forgotten, and very much haunted by memory. And in one of these places, let's call it Hollinford, there lived a woman named Elenora Hartwell. Not a remarkable name, not even unusual. But Elenora was what the villagers called the birthing woman, which meant she was the one people came to when things began, and sometimes when they ended. Midwives at that time were somewhere between medical professionals and witches, depending on who you asked. The church officially tolerated them, as long as they performed baptisms when a baby seemed unlikely to survive. But they were also viewed with a kind of wary respect, because everyone knew that childbirth wasn't just biology. It was theology, magic, and blood all mixed together. Elenora had been doing her work for over 30 years, which, statistically speaking, was already a miracle. Childbirth killed a lot of women. Helping other women give birth also killed a lot of women. But somehow, Elenora lived on. People said it was because she never slept. Others said she whispered the Lord's Prayer backward before every birth. And a few whispered something darker, that she kept something buried beneath the floorboards of her cottage. Now, Elenora kept records. This is where things get interesting. Most midwives couldn't write. But Elenora was educated. Barely, and oddly. A traveling priest had taught her letters years before, impressed by her knowledge of herbs. So she began keeping a ledger, part herbal manual, part birth record, part diary. Imagine it, a small book bound in rough leather, pages the color of old bones. Inside, she'd note, Anno Domini 1378 on the eve of St. Bridget. To Martha, wife of John the Miller, a daughter, healthy, baptized as Anne. Each birth got a line like that, precise, respectful, and calm. Even when the baby didn't make it, the entry stayed neat. Delivered a son. Returned to God no emotion, just ritual. As if she knew her task wasn't to grieve, but to witness. We don't know exactly how many pages she filled. But when the parish priest, one Father Ambrose, took over the records after her death, he noted that Mistress Elenora's book was most orderly, save the last leaf, which was defaced and colored in a red, unseemly hue. That's the polite medieval way of saying someone wrote in blood. Now, before we jump straight into the Gothic candle drama, let's ground ourselves in context. because of course not everything written in red ink meant blood. Red iron oxide inks, what they called rubia, were common for emphasis or signatures. But that's the thing. Elenora never used red before. Every other entry was in faded brown-black gall ink. Only the last one glowed red, even decades later. And the words, at least what survived in copies, read, "This child I cannot name. The mother I dare not tell. Born at the turning of the year, beneath the bell that tolls for no man creepy." Sure. But to her, it was probably just practical shorthand for don't ask questions. Still, let's float deeper into what that could have meant. By that winter, Hollinford was under strain. Food was short, the Lord's men were pressing more taxes, and perhaps most importantly, the local manners lady, Lady Isabel of Greyhaven, was 6 months pregnant. Her husband, Sir Thomas, had been away at war for nearly a year. Which, well, you can do the math. Rumors began swirling faster than the winter wind. The lady had been lonely. The stable boy, the chaplain, the passing minstrel. Each was accused in whispers, depending on who you didn't like that week. But Elenora didn't care for gossip. Her job was to bring the child safely, no matter who'd planted the seed. Except that, when the time came, the lady's maid came to fetch her in secret. No candles, no midwives from other villages, just Elenora. She arrived at the manor just before dawn, and whatever happened that night, she never wrote about it, except that final, red entry. Now, historians love to speculate, and this story has been chewed over by more than a few of them, especially after fragments of her ledger were found in the early 1800s, tucked inside a collection of parish documents. Some say the child was stillborn, and Elenora, terrified of the sin of an unbaptized baby, tried to hide it until she could perform a secret baptism herself. Others say the baby lived, but its identity had to be hidden. A bastard of noble blood could ruin families for generations. And some, mostly local folklore types, claimed the child was born with a mark. Not just a birthmark, but something that frightened everyone there. A caul over the face, maybe, or eyes that opened before the first breath. Medieval people had a knack for turning medical anomalies into omens. Whatever the truth, the next day, the manor's lady was said to have taken to her bed with illness. And by spring, she was dead. No funeral bells, no christening recorded, just silence. Elenora lived another year. And then, one morning, she was found in her cottage, sitting upright at her desk, her quill still in hand, her inkpot dry, the book open to that same crimson line. The priest buried her quietly, at dawn, without ceremony. No one wanted to talk about it. But people started leaving tiny tokens on her doorstep for years afterward. Bits of cloth, broken rosaries, sprigs of rosemary. Because even if she'd done something wrong, she'd also been the one who brought nearly every soul in the village into the world. Let's float a little wider now. What's fascinating about Elenora's story is that it's both one woman's mystery and every midwife's fate. Throughout medieval Europe, midwives stood at the intersection of faith and fear. They were simultaneously needed and distrusted. The church required them to know how to baptize infants in emergencies, because, of course, God forbid a baby die unblessed. But priests also accused them of witchcraft when births went wrong. You could save 20 lives one month and get blamed for a miscarriage the next. By the 1400s, manuals for inquisitors even included entire sections about the midwife's oath. It warned that some midwives supposedly offered the babe unto Satan before its first cry, which is dramatic, but also exactly the kind of hysteria you'd expect from medieval men who fainted at the sight of blood. Eleanora's real crime, most likely, was literacy. An educated woman who wrote things down was inherently suspicious, especially when those writings outlived her. The strange part is, her book didn't vanish. It resurfaced centuries later in the collection of an antiquarian named Robert Seagrave, who bought it at an estate sale around 1823. He called it the Hollinford Ledger and noted that one page appeared to have been dyed in a sanguine medium. He, being a man of science, decided to test it. He shaved a corner of the page, dissolved it in water, and, because apparently this was the 19th century, tasted it. He wrote, "It bears an iron tang, not unlike blood." So, there's that. But more interestingly, he transcribed the lines that came before the red entry. They read, "A child born on the feast of St. Agnes. Weak but breathing. Mother absent. To be kept under watch until the morrow." Then the red text followed, which suggests that the child did live, at least for a while. And if that's true, then someone, somewhere, might have carried on that bloodline. Half noble, half scandal. But here's the part I like best. In the margins of that same page, faint but visible under candlelight, Seagrave noted a little doodle, a circle, and inside it, a simple cross. Not a Christian one, but an equal-armed, folk kind of cross. A mark midwives used to bless newborns before church baptism. It's like Elenora couldn't help herself. Even in secrecy, even in fear, she performed the ritual. She marked the baby as living, as human. And then, she stopped writing. When you think about it, the midwife's secret isn't really about some hidden crime. It's about what history does to women like her, the ones who worked in the margins, literally, recording life while being written out of it. Her ledger wasn't just births. It was proof that she existed. And maybe that last red entry wasn't blood at all. Maybe it was her final act of rebellion, writing in a color that wouldn't fade, no matter how many centuries passed. Anyway, that's the first half of the story. Next time, we'll drift into what happened to the child, the legends it inspired, and how Eleanora's curse supposedly followed the Greyhaven family through generations, right into the 1600s. But for now, let's end softly, the way she might have ended her nights. A candle guttering low, quill set aside, hands stained with ink. Outside, a quiet village, breathing in sleep. And somewhere, a child, real or imagined, whose name no one ever wrote down. Hey, again. Still awake? Yeah, me neither. Let's drift back into it. When we left off, Elenora Hartwell, the midwife of Hollinford, had made her final entry in that now famous red ink. The child's name was never recorded. The mother's name was hidden. And the only clue we had was that odd phrase, "Born at the turning of the year, beneath the bell that tolls for no man." So, what happened next? Well, the answer depends on who you ask and how much you're willing to believe. The records from Hollinford go quiet for nearly a decade after that. The parish priest, Father Ambrose, died a few winters later, apparently from what he described as an affliction of the chest and the soul. Translation, probably tuberculosis and maybe guilt. Then, around the year 1390, a new entry appears in the manor accounts of nearby Greyhaven. It notes the arrival of a young ward of uncertain birth, to be kept for upbringing in the service of the house. No name, no parents listed, just that. But the steward's handwriting, bless his meticulous little heart, added a note in the margin. Brought by an old woman from Hollinford, wrapped in linen and marked with a red cross upon the brow. So, yes, you can probably see where this is going. The child, a girl, grew up at Greyhaven under the name Agnes, a convenient saint's name that could fit any foundling. And while there's no direct proof she was Eleanora's unnamed child, well, no one else seems to fit the timeline quite so neatly. Agnes was said to be quiet, too quiet. The kind of child that unnerved medieval people, who strongly preferred their children loud, obedient, and clearly terrified of sin. The maids at Greyhaven said she never cried, not once. Even when she burned her hand on the cooking fire or fell from a cart and split her lip open, nothing. The cook reportedly muttered, "She was born without pain, and she'll die without it." Which is unsettling, even by 14th century standards. Let's float a bit through what life at Greyhaven would have looked like for someone like her. It wasn't exactly Downton Abbey. The manor was more like a fortified farm, with cold halls, low ceilings, and about 5 layers of grime on every surface. The nobles themselves, Sir Thomas having returned from war and promptly fallen ill with gout, spent most of their days arguing over taxes and inheritance. Last Isabel, the supposed mother of the mysterious child, was long dead by this point. But her ghost, or at least the idea of her, lingered in the gossip of the servants. And every time Agnes walked into a room, someone would whisper that she had Lady Isabel's eyes, or her hair, or her silence. Which is probably the medieval version of saying, "You look just like your mom," except with more existential dread. By the time Agnes turned 12, things got weird. Now, I know, this is medieval history. Everything was weird. But this was especially so. The Greyhaven estate began reporting what they called the sleeping afflictions. One by one, members of the household started falling into deep, sudden sleeps. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. They'd wake up confused, but unharmed. Except for one thing. They always dreamed of the same place. A room filled with candles, and a woman writing at a desk in red ink. Some of them described her so clearly that even the local priest said, "It must be the spirit of the midwife." Which, of course, was followed by several frantic exorcisms that didn't do much except make everyone hungrier. Agnes herself seemed untouched by it all. She never slept more than a few hours, never fell ill. And according to one record, she could foretell the hour of birth for every cow and woman within a league. Which, let's be honest, is an impressive party trick. Word spread fast. Soon people were traveling to Greyhaven to see her, pregnant women mostly, hoping she could bless their babies or ease their labor pains. And she did, over and over again. Every child she marked with her red thread survived. But the parish priest, now a zealous man named Father Benedict, wasn't thrilled. He accused her of usurping divine authority and demanded she stop. She refused, quietly, without words. Just that same unsettling calm she'd always had. And so, naturally, he did what all medieval men did when they met a woman who scared them. He called her a witch. There's a trial record from 1403 that lists her full name, Agnes of Hollinford, aged about 25. She was accused of keeping the devil's mark and dealing in the births of the unblessed. That last charge, yeah, that's a fancy way of saying midwifery. The irony being, of course, that the church still relied on midwives, but also condemned them whenever they got too popular. During her interrogation, witnesses claimed she showed no fear, no anger, no sadness. She just said one thing, according to the scribe. "I was born beneath the bell that tolls for no man. I am not his to take." And that line, that's the same phrase her supposed mother, Elenora, wrote in red ink. Which means either this girl somehow knew about the midwife's ledger, hidden for years, or something stranger was going on. The trial never finished. Half the jury fell ill before it could conclude. And one night, Agnes was simply gone, vanished from her cell. The guards swore they'd locked the door. The chains were still closed. Only a bit of wax remained on the floor. Red wax, like from a candle. Father Benedict called it the devil's work. The villagers called it justice. And the story, well, the story grew. Over the next century, Greyhaven Manor developed a reputation. Not a bad one necessarily, just odd. Every few generations, a woman would be born into the family, or arrive mysteriously from outside, who shared the same traits, the same calmness, the same strange knowledge of childbirth. And, according to some letters from the 1500s, a mark on her wrist, a faint cross, equal-armed, like the one Elenora had drawn in her ledger. They called it the mark of the midwife, and they said that whenever one of them died, the next would begin dreaming of a candlelit desk. Let's pause for a second, because of course, this is where folklore takes over and historians start rolling their eyes. There's no concrete proof that Agnes or Elenora shared some mystical bloodline. But here's what is documented. The Greyhaven family produced an unusually high number of female healers, wise women, and midwives over the next 200 years. Even during the witch-hunting frenzy of the 1600s, they somehow avoided mass persecution. Either they were lucky, or they knew how to keep their secrets quiet. And tucked inside a private collection in Oxford today, yes, a real one, you can find a fragment of parchment labeled The Hollinford Births, 1378-1381. The handwriting matches Elenora's. The ink is dark brown, except for one tiny line near the bottom that's been carefully scraped off. When examined under light, the words faintly read, "She will return when the bells are silent." You see, that's what fascinates me about these stories. Not whether they're true, because, honestly, most of them probably aren't, but how real they felt to the people who told them. The villagers of Hollinford didn't think they were living in a world of superstition. To them, everything made perfect sense. God ruled heaven. The church ruled earth. And women like Elenora filled the impossible space in between, where faith met flesh and birth brushed up against death. Every midwife was a theologian, whether she wanted to be or not. Every birth was a sermon, every loss a confession. By the early 1600s, the legend of the red ink midwife had spread far beyond Greyhaven. It even shows up in a pamphlet printed in London in 1621, titled The Woman Who Wrote in Blood. It's written in that wonderfully dramatic early modern style, full of moral warnings and casual misogyny. The story had evolved by then. In that version, Elenora was said to have sold her soul to keep one dying child alive. The red ink became literal blood, and her descendants were cursed to serve in shadow until their name be writ again. Honestly, it's Gothic gold. But it also says a lot about how women's labor, especially around childbirth, was both sacred and terrifying to men who didn't understand it. By the time Enlightenment rolled around, no one believed in haunted midwives anymore, or at least they said they didn't. But in the parish records of Hollinford, recompiled in 1723, there's an interesting footnote. It lists an Agnes Hartwell, midwife, operating in the district since 1708. That's nearly 300 years after the first Elenora. The scribe added, known for her uncommon stillness and skill. Keeps her notes most precise and writes her blessings in red coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the bell that tolls for no man never really stopped ringing. And that's the thing about history. It doesn't always end. Sometimes it just fades, until someone rediscovers it and starts whispering again. Every generation needs its ghosts, after all. Some haunt castles, others just haunt ideas. Elenora's story isn't really about witchcraft or blood curses. It's about how knowledge, especially women's knowledge, survives. Even when it's outlawed, even when it's burned, even when it's written in a language no one wants to read anymore. And if somewhere out there, a quiet woman still writes down the names of the newly born in red ink, well, maybe that's just how history keeps breathing. Part 3. The Return of the Red Ink, the Enlightenment, and the Last Midwife of Hollinford. Hey, again, you're still here. That's impressive. Or maybe you just didn't find the remote. Either way, welcome back. Let's pick up the thread, or, well, the red thread. When we left off, the Greyhaven lineage had carried the quiet, unnerving legacy of Elenora Hartwell for centuries. A lineage of women who healed, who listened, who wrote, and who, somehow, always seemed to exist slightly outside of time. Now we're moving forward to the 18th century. The world is changing. The church is losing its grip. Coffee is replacing ale as the morning drink of choice. And somewhere in Paris, people are beginning to call superstition unfashionable. But in the countryside, in a small, damp corner of England, the old stories never really die. They just grow moss. The year is 1741, and Hollinford is barely even a village anymore. Half its fields are empty. The old manor of Greyhaven has fallen into disrepair. A roof sagging, windows cracked, ivy clawing at the stones. The few families that remain mostly keep to themselves. But one woman stands out, as she always seems to. Her name, Margaret Hartwell. Yes, that Hartwell. Because apparently this family line refuses to go quietly. Margaret was born in the year 1708, the same year Queen Anne died. Her mother died in childbirth, because of course she did. And her father, a tenant farmer, raised her as best he could until he died of a fever of the damp. Translation: probably pneumonia and a lifetime of bad insulation. By 16, she was apprenticed to the parish midwife, a sharp-tongued widow named Joan Briggs, who taught her everything she knew about childbirth, herbs, and the art of not letting priests interfere. Joan used to say, "You can save 10 mothers and still get blamed for the 11th. Margaret learned that lesson early. Now, by this point in history, midwifery was starting to be overtaken by men, or, as they called themselves, man midwives. Because of course they did. It wasn't enough that women had been delivering babies for thousands of years. Suddenly, a few men in powdered wigs decided it was a medical science. And sure, they brought in forceps, textbooks, and a lot of Latin words that didn't actually help anyone in labor. But they also brought authority. Midwives, especially rural ones, started to be seen as outdated, remnants of a superstitious age. Margaret, however, didn't seem to mind. She kept working, quietly, efficiently, and people trusted her because she didn't just know bodies. She knew souls. When a woman was in labor, she'd light a single candle by the bed and murmur something that sounded like a prayer, or maybe an old rhyme. And when she made her records afterward, she always used the same ink. Red. That detail comes from her personal notebook. Yes, it